Okay, I can see us now live on YouTube as well as
It
live
should
on
be in
Zoom.
a second. It's still doing its little assessment of sort of my bandwidth. I think there we are. Yes, we are on.
Okay, we are live. We are live across all of the platforms. We control the horizontal and control the vertical. Here we go. Excellent. Let's get going in that case. Welcome everyone to our final keynote address of this wonderful conference. I am Matthew Sangster. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and I'm a core member of the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic. I'll do this again at the end, but I'd just like to take this opportunity at the beginning of the panel to thank the organisers of this excellent conference. That's Taylor Driggers, Lucy Holdsworth, MacDonald, and Luise Rössel. I think it's been really well organised. It's run incredibly smoothly, particularly considering all the technology involved. It's been intellectually stimulating, and it's been extremely welcoming, which I think is always the sign of an excellent conference. Housekeeping. We do not have an active chat function on Zoom or on YouTube. We'd like to encourage people to take part in the dedicated discussion channel for the keynote on the conference Discord server. You can use the recommended text channel if there's anything you'd like to recommend there in terms of Alana's talk. We have a Q&A function on the Zoom. If you have questions that occur to you during the talk, that would be great if you would post them there. We'll pick those up at the end. You can also post those in the Discord and on the YouTube live stream page. We'll try and pick up from those as well. If you are live tweeting, the hashtag is Dissenting Beliefs. If you are here, I am told to remind you to observe the Centre for Fantasy and the Fantastic's Code of Conduct and Etiquette guidelines on platforms during these sessions. If you need automated captions, you can turn those on Zoom. I think those are also available on YouTube. And yes, as I said before, questions in the Q&A box as we go along. So I am delighted to welcome our final speaker at this conference, Alana Vincent. Alana Vincent is Professor of Jewish Philosophy, Religion and Imagination at the University of Chester. Their published work engages with a wide range of topics relating to religion, memory, and cultural imaginaries, from commemorations of mass killings to the afterlives of biblical texts. They published several monographs, including Culture, Communion and Recovery, Tolkienian Fairy Story, and Interreligious Exchange. And they're currently researching the ways that popular narratives such as comic books and superhero movies shape public perceptions of post-genocide reconciliation. Born in Canada, they currently reside in Liverpool with their partner and 2 cats, who will probably interrupt if they're doing usual cat-like things at some point during this talk. Alana's talk today will be, as you can see, the Affordances of Fantasy, and I shall now disappear so that she can give it. Thank you very much, Alana.
Thank you, Matt. And thank everyone who's been involved in this conference. It's been a fantastic day. We have heard so many really rich papers, really deep engagements with specific works that help us to see the ways that fantasy literature helps to create space for heterodoxies and heresies, forms of being in the world and being religious in the world, that normative doctrinal expressions of religion, which up until this last panel, most of the speakers I heard in the parallel sessions I was in were understanding largely as Christian normative. Don't make room for. What I want to do at the end of today, which I'm realizing is maybe not the best way to end a long day when we're all starting to be a little bit tired and a little bit cold, and it's getting a little bit dark here, but this is the paper I wrote, so we're gonna go with it. I want to follow all of this engagement with specific works by making kind of a larger claim about fantasy. And that claim is that as useful as the formal understanding of fantasy about, primary and secondary worlds may be, we might be better served by thinking of fantasy functionally. And the claim I want to make about the function of fantasy is that it's about changing the world, not about thinking about worlds that aren't our own, but actually changing this world. I want to spend the time this afternoon both defending that claim, but also giving some sense of what's at stake in that defense. So let me just start by giving a brief explanation of the title of this paper. In the work of the psychologist James Gibson, an affordance is something that our environment offers to us, or the environment offers to the animal, but Gibson correctly thinks we're all animals. It's a feature of the landscape that prompts action from those who inhabit it. Now, in design theory, affordances are more usually positive features, features that make it possible for an object to be used as intended, features that invite use, like the handle on my mug that lets me pick it up is an affordance. Affordances are the opposite of obstacles, which are features that make use difficult. So when I talk about the affordances of fantasy, I'm talking specifically about how fantasy changes the world in a way that makes it easier, or indeed possible, to live in. A way that mitigates the obstacles to existence that we might otherwise experience from a world shaped unrelentingly by Christian normative religious doctrine and its post-Christian survivals, because of course, we know, or if we didn't know then already, then spending about 5 minutes skimming the work of Richard Dawkins, Philip Pullman, or other movement atheists would teach us that getting past Christian normativity involves a great deal more than simply declaring oneself to be no longer invested in Christian structures of belief. Indeed, most explicitly anti-Christian movements in modernity have simply succeeded in reinscribing some of the most problematic aspects of Christian worldviews, particularly in terms of their totalizing universalism. So, that stage setting out of the way, I want to begin not with literature, but actually with the philosophical turn that immediately followed the Second World War, which gave lie to explicit and implicit claims of European Christian cultural superiority, of intellectual and technical progress, leading to not just a more comfortable existence, but actually objectively better forms of human being. The crisis in philosophy that was precipitated by the evidence of the death camps is, of course, not the most significant outcome of that period, but for the sake of argument today, it's the one we are going to be attending to. So let's start by considering the division between the continental and analytic schools of philosophy, which in my reading was rather exacerbated by the post-Holocaust crisis, although it perceptibly existed prior to that point. Now, in the Anglo-American analytic tradition, what we see in the years immediately following the liberation of the camps is a sharp turn towards moral realism. The belief or the philosophical commitment to the assumption that goodness and badness, or good and evil, right and wrong, have an independent, objectively verifiable existence, that they are not culturally determined, socially constructed, or in any way negotiable. Now, this was the concern that largely united the otherwise quite disparate thinkers who came out of Oxford in the 1940s and 1950s, whose lives and works are chronicled in Benjamin Lipscomb's very recent volume, The Women Are Up to Something. So thinkers like Mary Midgley, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, Mary Warnock, and especially Iris Murdoch. Now, these women represented among them nearly every religious position that was admissible in polite British society at the time. Catholic, Anglican, an atheist who nevertheless still attended Anglican services, an atheist who didn't attend Anglican services. That was kind of it. There were, of course, also Jewish philosophers at Oxford at the time, notably A.J. Ayer, whose own work on moral philosophy is distinctly unsympathetic and at times starkly opposed to the moral realism that was the uniting factor among the wartime women group. But women had only been formally admitted to Oxford in 1920, so we can maybe understand without having to dwell too long on the intersections of prejudice and social disadvantage, which may have prevented Jewish women in particular from entering, and particularly from pursuing the study of philosophy, which was at the time something more of a leisure activity for the wealthy than a career to be pursued by anyone who actually needed to earn a living. Anyways, we have these 5 women working in close proximity to each other, all with some degree of commitment to moral realism as the antidote to the empty, value-averse language games, which characterized for them the approach to philosophy which the Holocaust so effectively discredited, although, as we've said, didn't really discredit it for thinkers like Ayer. To the extent that genocide is generative in an intellectual sense, it generates, and it must generate, a sense of wrongness, sheer, inescapable, objective wrongness. And it's from that sense of wrongness that the wartime women began to rebuild a more credible philosophy. And one of the tools they used in its construction was the faculty of imagination. Now, I'm not going to make you sit through a review of the way that each of these 5 women engaged with imagination in her work. Life is short. We'll just work on 2. Warnock and Murdoch had the most extensive and overt engagement with questions about imagination as an ethical faculty. Now, both of them ground their engagement, at least partially, in their reading of Jean-Paul Sartre. Although Murdoch was ultimately a sharp critic of his philosophy, she had also written the first exposition of Sartre's thought to appear in English, which Warnock then later made heavy use of in the trilogy of books on existentialism, which she published prior to her 1976 monograph specifically on imagination. And in spite of her critical stance towards his thought in general, Murdoch did accept, as did Warnock, Sartre's account of a strict logical division between the imaginary and the real. Something can only be imagined if it is not real. Because if it is real, it isn't imagined, it's something that we have direct sensory experience of, right? So for Sartre and following Sartre for Warnock and Murdoch, imagination is the mental faculty which permits us to consider things that we do not have directly in front of us, providing us sensory input. Now, Warnock treats Sartre as primarily a commentator on the formation of mental images, although she builds on his treatment of the relationship between imaginative and agential capacities to develop her own theory of imagination as central to the process of education, which is the thing that she's really concerned with in the 1970s, because she's sitting on a special government commission on special education while she's writing this book. So imagination is central to the process of education. Conversely, imagination is a mental faculty which must be developed by education. She views imagination ultimately as a social good. So it benefits everyone if each of us have a properly educated, properly cultivated imagination. Murdoch takes a similar approach, but where Warnock ends up speaking a bit more in generalities about the importance of cultivating the imagination, Murdoch gets a lot more into detail on precisely how to cultivate a good imagination in support of this social good that both of them agree exists. Murdoch's thought on the cultivation of the imagination as a social good is summed up nicely in a 1978 interview. Good art trains people to be better, more aware, more ethical. Bad art does the opposite. This isn't new, and it's not unique to Murdoch. Of course, we see similar concerns voiced all through the 19th century. What's happening here is really just adding a little bit more philosophical meat to the bones of that same old moral panic and reorienting it in reference to the questions of moral development raised by the Holocaust. How could people as noble and cultured as the Germans do something as awful as committing genocide? Did they not listen to enough Beethoven? Maybe they just listened to Beethoven in the wrong way. Murdoch's understanding of fantasy as a characteristic of bad art is, of course, a generic rather than genre-specific use of the term. So it's worth pausing for just a moment to assess to what extent her criticism is relevant to our own genre-specific concerns. Now, of course, we know that Murdoch did not entirely reject fantasy as a genre. She wrote J.R.R. Tolkien a rather effusive letter expressing her fondness for The Lord of the Rings. She regretted that she couldn't write it in fluent Elvish. And yet, if I may be forgiven for very briefly invoking one of the authors specifically not supposed to be discussed today, readers familiar with Tolkien might recognize Murdoch's main objection to bad art here, that the heroes are too good, and that they inevitably obtain a happily ever after ending, as substantially also an objection to Tolkien's formulation of the generic characteristics of fantasy or fairy story. Now, we might well object that Tolkien's idea of the happy ending is precisely not the formulaic inevitability that Murdoch objects to, but something altogether deeper and more profound. We may also object that, to Tolkien, such happy endings are not untrue, but rather an essentially theological statement on the already redeemed nature of the world. So, Murdoch does not object per se to novels which say something true about the nature of this world by means of otherworldly settings. And Tolkien does not consider fantasy to be involved in the business of creating new worlds, so much as showing readers a more true vision of this world. Instead, we should understand the bad fantasy that Murdoch objects to in opposition to what Bridget Clark helpfully labels the moral imagination. And Clark introduces this term in contrast with the unmodified imagination, which Murdoch treats as an entirely neutral mental faculty, except for when she uses it to mean what Clark re-articulates as moral imagination. Moral imagination accomplishes precisely what Tolkienian fairy story does in terms of orienting the reader to a deeper, more profound understanding of the world as it really is. And that's all well and good if our vision of the world as it really is, the vision revealed to us through this good, morally educative art, is a world that's actually hospitable to us. If the heroines who find their sudden, unlooked-for redemption and their hard-earned reward are beings whose choices and life trajectories we can actually see as somehow relevant to our own movement through this world, whose shape they are meant to be demonstrating to us. But, not to put too fine a point on it, this isn't always the case. Right? Some of us experience the world as essentially intensely hostile to our very being. And what we need, desperately, is not to be assured that no, it actually is all fine, really. We don't need to be educated in how to live in this world. We need tools to change it. Now, Murdoch was, in my estimation, the last serious thinker in the Anglo-analytic tradition and the only analytic philosopher who has ever understood fiction well enough to say something useful about it. And even Iris Murdoch saw fiction more as a tool for promoting philosophical ideas than something that's really generative in its own right. So this is a good time for us to switch our focus to the other side of the great philosophical divide. Now, the post-Holocaust trend in continental philosophy was less towards moral realism and more towards a complete re-evaluation of the task of philosophy, largely along the lines drawn by Emmanuel Levinas, ethics as first philosophy. The question of ethical relations to the other displaced ontology and metaphysics as the primary concern of philosophy. And I am painting with a very broad brush here, of course, but bear with me. In this approach, we are far less concerned with objectively verifiable reality, not even the objectively verifiable existence of good and evil, but rather with reality as a collection of intersecting subjectivities. The task of philosophy in this tradition then becomes to navigate those intersections. We do not, therefore, see the same split between moral philosophy or ethics and other subfields. Rather, we see an integration between, for example, and this is not a randomly chosen example, social ethics and philosophies of language. And that merge, I want to say, is particularly evident in the work of Paul Ricoeur. And what I really want to talk about for most of the rest of today is Ricoeur's work. First his theory of metaphor, and then his later work on fiction. That we need to understand what he's doing with metaphor before we understand what he really does with fiction. Now, Ricoeur's theorization of metaphor rejected a more classical approach, which treated metaphor largely as a word-for-word substitution. So the simple substitution of one word for another, which in that classical account has the effect of drawing the reader's attention to a previously unnoticed similarity between the two ideas represented by those words. All the world's a stage. In what ways is the world, in fact, like a stage? I hadn't thought about that before, right? Instead of that word-for-word substitution, Ricoeur argues metaphor is actually the function of a sentence, right? Metaphor is placing those words in relation with each other and mediating between them at the sentence level. And what the mediation that sentence is doing is not just introducing this idea of similarity. Instead, it's mediating a much more complex relationship, drawing the reader's attention simultaneously to both that previously unnoticed similarity, but also the difference between the two concepts at play. Just as Sartre maintained that the very act of imagining emphasizes the non-reality of the thing imagined, Ricoeur is maintaining that the very act of pointing out similarities emphasizes the inherent distinction of the things that you're pointing out similarities in, because if they were identical, you wouldn't need to point out similarities. Now, because metaphor creates this relationship between these two previously unrelated concepts, it minimally, the minimal claim we can make about what metaphor does is redescribes reality. It gives us a different way of thinking about the reality that already exists. But Ricoeur is also following reader response theory in viewing meaning as something which readers derive from texts and which is thus constructed rather than discovered in the act of reading. And so for Ricoeur, redescription is not just a rendering of a different account of the world as it is, it's an alteration in the fundamental structure of the world. Now, it's worth spending just a little bit of time. I am so sorry that we are doing semiotics at sunset. This is cruel and unusual. This will be fast and painless, I promise. Spend a little bit of time just reviewing the mechanisms at work here and remembering the basic terminology of structural linguistics so that we can keep track of what we're saying for the rest of this talk. Remember, all communication is a series of signs, which are the possible, smallest possible units of communicable meaning. And a sign itself is a combination of a signifier, the thing that communicates meaning, the word, the symbol, the image, and a referent, the meaning that the signifier is actually communicating. And of course, signifiers have different sorts of relationships to their reference, ranging from the more concrete to the entirely abstract. The important thing to bear in mind here is that linguistic signifiers are very much on the abstract, arbitrary end of the spectrum. There is, as a general rule, nothing in the character of a thing itself which demands or even anticipates our use of any particular pattern of sounds to refer to it. And the arbitrary nature of linguistic signifiers is the key to Ricoeur's wider theory of fiction. Now, before moving on, I am going to share with you the most important thing about Ricoeur that anyone ever told me. And I learned this from the late Pamela Sue Anderson, may her memory be a blessing. Most of the theories that Ricoeur expounds upon across multiple volumes of his monographs, like Time and Narrative, most of those theories he presents much more clearly in much shorter essays. So if you want to get your head around Ricoeur's thought, always start with the essays, and I will be following this model in this talk. We are not looking at Time and Narrative or Oneself as Another. We're just looking at some essays. Specifically, his 1979 essay, The Function of Fiction in Shaping Reality. And in this essay, Ricoeur takes issue with what he presents as the common philosophical understanding of what fiction is and how it works. His presentation of that understanding is that fiction consists basically of combinations and recombinations of images, which are themselves derived from sensory experience. An image has to be of something, and that something must always have its roots in the world as it is. So fiction can only ever be that very minimal redescription of the world. It's only ever going to be, just these slightly different arrangements, these, rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic of the world as it is. The classical example Ricoeur uses to explain the account of fiction generation is the centaur. Horses exist. Humans exist. We can see both horses and humans. We can form mental images of both horses and humans. And then we can perform a mental operation which combines those images together into a hybrid horse-human creature. And thus, the argument goes, we clearly see that imaginary creatures, fictions, such as the centaur, are clearly rooted in direct experience of the world as it is, which we can therefore never successfully alter, and from which we can therefore never successfully escape. Ricoeur's issue with this argument is very similar to his issue with the classical account of how metaphors work. He maintains that bringing two previously unrelated concepts into relationship is, in fact, the creation of a new thing, which does not have a referent in the world as it is. Now here, he's directly combating Sartre's account of imagination as emphasizing the unreality of the imagined thing, as Sartre maintains allegiance to the notion of images reflecting some sensory perception of the world as it is. The act of imagination, in a Sartrean sense, must therefore emphasize the absence of the imagined thing, but cannot emphasize its unreality. Unfortunately, as Ricoeur says, absence and unreality are very often confused. It might be helpful to visualize Ricoeur's argument in this way. Images are signs which unite a present signifier with a referent which, while absent, nevertheless has an existence in the world as it is, which is in no way dependent on its signifier. Fiction, by contrast, consists solely of the signifier. Its referent is not absent, but non-existence. There is no thing in the world as it is to which the fictional signifier can refer. Thus, the fictional signifier brings its referent into being by virtue of its signification. something which is possible primarily because of the completely arbitrary nature of linguistic signifiers. And so, Ricoeur argues, language does not merely describe, but actively creates new realities. And that, I want to suggest, is a far better account of the function of not just fiction in general, but fantasy in particular, than the account that we could render with the aid of Murdoch and Tolkien. I don't believe for a minute that we need fantasy to help us come to terms with the world as it is. Those of us who occupy marginal positions in the social and racial and religious and gender hierarchies of the world as it is, and who survive from one day to the next while occupying those positions, already know better than to expect any sudden rescue, any happy ending. We don't need fiction to remind us that redemption is for straight, white, Christian men and for anyone else who can align themselves enough with one of those qualities to get at least a little bit of the redemptive backsplash. We need fiction to introduce things that we don't see possibilities for in this world right now. So, to conclude, I want to turn to consideration of just a few examples in fiction that I find generative to think with in this way. There's Michael Chabon's Gentleman of the Road, which I think is actually the most compelling work of post-Holocaust fiction that I've read, and it's very short, it's a novella. Chabon said that he wrote it under the working title, Jews with Swords. But unlike a lot of post-Holocaust Jews with swords kinds of fantasy writing, it's not a power reversal fantasy. It's just a world where Jews exist and they have swords. It draws on the medieval philosopher Yehuda Halevai's great fantasy, the Khazaria, to establish a medieval kingdom of Jews which maybe actually existed or maybe never did. Historians are very divided on this. Personally, I think Halevai was creating a fiction that helped him have the argument that he needed to have at that point in time. But anyways, the medieval kingdom of Jews, in which Jews are there. They have adventures. They commit crime. They have fully normal lives, but very swashbuckling adventure kinds of lives. This is also the theme of Shara Glassman's Mangoverse, which is less widely known than Chabon's work. Shara Glassman has not won a Pulitzer Prize, and in fact largely self-publishes these days, but she's spun this out over 4 books and then a bunch of short stories, so she has much more developed world building in the Mangoverse. And these stories focus on the kingdom, the fictional kingdom of Perath, which is, it's a little bit more of a Middle Eastern, maybe North African, maybe Southern Spain. Everything's very tropical. Everything's very shaped by Sephardi customs rather than Ashkenazi customs. But Perath is sufficiently capacious that it features different kinds of Jews who have different lives, different approaches to how to be in the world, including the lesbian queen Shulamit and her consort Aviva. Now, in both Glassman and Chabon's fantasies, there is conflict. Right? These aren't just warm, fuzzy, happy group hug, nothing ever goes wrong kinds of world building. And there's even conflict over Jewishness, over ways to be Jewish in the world, but it's conflict between Jews, in which the survival and religious legitimacy of Judaism as a way of being in the world is never something that's opened up to question. It's never something that needs to be defended in itself. It's just part of the taken for granted background against which other sorts of conflict unfold. And that, my friends, is a fiction that creates a possibility in the world that has never existed previous to it being written. Now, similarly, there's Rebecca Roanhorse's Sixth World series. Now, I mention this with caution because, of course, it's been extremely controversial, largely due to claims by the DNA Writers Collective that Roanhorse, in writing these books, was illegitimately appropriating Diné spiritual beliefs, and counterclaims that the Diné Writers Collective's refusal to acknowledge Roanhorse's legitimate claim to belonging through marriage is grounded in anti-Blackness, absolutely none of which I am remotely qualified to mediate, and so I am not going to try. Instead, what I want to focus on here is the post-apocalyptic setting of the books, in which a series of earthquakes and floods have destroyed most of the colonized lands and colonizing people of the current United States. But the Diné survive, protected by gods and magic, which return to the world precisely to make sure they survive. Now, the other criticism from the Diné Writers Collective is Roanhorse's depictions of Diné people in these books living in poverty and squalor, although here I do feel quite secure in pointing out that those depictions are perfectly consistent with other post-apocalyptic fantasies. Leaving that aside, I just want to pause and again appreciate the power of a post-colonial fantasy that is not based on role reversal or revenge, but instead just gets rid of the colonizers via an act of gods before the story even opens, leaving the residents of Dinéta, like Chabon's Jews with Swords or Glassman's lesbian queens, free to just live their lives on their own terms, without having to structure those lives around a struggle with hegemonic white Christianity. By refusing to center struggle, these narratives and others like them decenter the totalizing universalism of Christian or Christian normative doctrinal accounts of the world, and in so doing, they rob those accounts of their constitutive power. When our survival is not part of the structure of reality, when it is not a given in the world as it is, we not only do not need, we absolutely cannot tolerate stories which simply reinscribe that reality, training us to die quietly and with minimal fuss so that the real heroes of the story can go on and earn their happy redemptive ending. We need instead fictions that create for us the possibility of life. That is the affordance of fantasy. It suggests, and by suggesting actively creates, possibilities for life where none existed before. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Sorry, I had the Q&A box covering up the mute and start video button, so I could not reappear in a timely fashion. But thanks, that was a really wonderful paper and talk. I will encourage people to post questions in the Q&A if they have sort of things that they would like to raise. I think it's a really rich and generative talk, and not in any way sort of too demanding for the end of a day. It is a dark night, but always a good time to think about semiotics.
I always feel when I start having to remember signifiers and reference, because I'm going to need to use that language, I always do worry that this is not the talk that anyone signed up for. But
no, I think it's a great talk to bring together a whole sort of series of themes that have been coming sort of through the conference. I guess if no one else has any question immediately for the Q&A, I can ask a question. I like this idea about the affordances of fantasy as a sort of a space in which new reality is not determined by the assumptions of sort of prevailing society and its institutions are possible. But I wonder whether there's sort of a kind, I mean, I'm thinking mainly of the sort of objections of people like Helen Young and Emily Elizabeth Thomas, that within fantasies there's still a default to the reproduction of certain kinds of tropes, and in fact some of the fantasies that make use of the full affordances of fantasies end up marginalized in certain ways. So I just wondered whether you might want to sort of say a little bit about the ability, that tendency for certain kinds of sort of fantasies that sell well or that circulate enormously widely to not use this potential for expansion.
Well, I think that's why I did start out by saying I was wanting to move us away from the formal definition of fantasy, which would be, fantasy is a genre of writing that has, these sets of formal characteristics, largely oriented around secondary worlds, or maybe some magic, or maybe something about the way those secondary worlds are furnished, and think a lot more carefully about fantasy from a functionalist perspective, which is fictions which create those affordances. So I realize this is a controversial claim. I think what I'm trying to say is, regardless of the formal characteristics, fiction which does not create those affordances, and it's not something, I won't go as far as to say it's not fantasy, but it's not something I think is useful or interesting to think about in the way that I want to think about fantasy, and in the way that I think most of, I can't say all because we were in parallel sessions, I didn't hear every single paper, but every single paper I heard today was also wanting to think about fantasy.
Yeah, so sort of in some ways, fantasy exists at the point where it is expanding, where it's not, then it's sort of effectively falling into. So you're aligning the kind of fantasy you want to see with the kinds of powers that would exist with the sort of Coleridgean or the Murdochian creative imagination, and saying that is genuine fantasy, and that sort of other kinds of replication are more like the sorts of things that Ryan Atterbury might align with formula, for example, and therefore not fulfilling the potential of the fantastic in some ways.
Yeah, exactly. And those sorts of works can also be interesting to think about in other contexts, but
so fantasy becomes something that a text does rather than something that a text is, in opening up spaces. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Okay, we have our first question in. So anonymous attendee, being shy, but that is allowed, asks, sort of says, thank you for such an amazing keynote. It sounds as though you see fantasy as an act of protest or a kind of activism. Is that fair? If so, do you see the two being connected outside the creation of fantasy texts? Can texts have an afterlife of activism once they're created?
I can definitely see where that follows from what I said, although that's a formulation that had not occurred to me until you raised it. And so as I'm thinking very quickly through this, I'm saying, okay, if fantasy is an act of protest or a form of activism, then whose protest is it? And certainly we know that there are writers who do write as a form of protest, of activism. But I am going to slide back to that reader response move and the idea that the meaning of a text is not something that a writer puts into the text, straight from their brain onto the page, and then a reader uploads it from the page into their own brain, right? Reading is a conversation. Meaning is generated both through the process of writing and through the process of reading. The meaning of this communication is being generated both through the words coming out of my mouth and what your brain is doing with them. Your brain just did something with them that mine hadn't yet, right? So I don't think we can say that fantasy is an act of protest, a form of activism, because so much of what fantasy does depends on its readers. Right? Fantasy can become, and I'm wanting to prioritize and center forms of fantasy which are more malleable towards being received as activism, if what we understand by activism is active engagement with the world. But let's not go too far and say that if you read something and for you it has no world altering capacities at all, it's just a fun story, that's still fantasy. It may still be functioning as fantasy in other contexts with other readers.
So fantasy is something that happens to readers rather than something that inheres. I think that's a really good point. I know we're not really supposed to mention Tolkien, but I think there's sort of sometimes Tolkien's own conservatism gets read onto the Lord of the Rings, which is in fact quite radical in some of the things that it's doing. It has definitely been read radically in all sorts of ways. You get a very conservative reads it as being about Aragorn, but that's not what it's about in all sorts of respects.
Okay, we are going to get the organizers really, really mad at us if I start answering that, because then we're just going to be back and forth. But yeah, I take your point.
Yeah, I guess a better example might be the sort of the reading of spaces, queer spaces into Lord of the Rings in fan fiction or in responses or those sorts of things. That sort of provides a jumping off point for a world. What the way that someone originally writes a fantasy does not determine the way that everyone uses it or receives it.
Well, I'm seeing that I'm less with Lord of the Rings these days, but my undergraduate students now are of the age that they grew up on Harry Potter, and are now, many of them, of the age and of the positioning where they have to re-engage and reread and reconstruct that deeply formative narrative in a way that doesn't choke the life out of them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example. There's a question here, another question from an anonymous attendee. I don't know whether you had things switched to anonymous, but could you This is the question asked, could you expand on the problems with formulaic fantasy? Is formulaic opposed to imaginative? I don't know whether those are terms I've introduced that you wouldn't accept, or do you say so if that's the case? But
well, no, I think the formulaic fantasy is, that's largely what Murdoch is complaining about, right? It's the, pat formula, we know who the hero is and they are going to be unreasonably good, and anyone that they have conflict with is going to be a pantomime villain, and everything will end happily ever after. They'll get everything they could possibly want. The end. So the problem with that formula is that it is, Murdoch did not like those sorts of stories because she thought they were false. They taught people the wrong things about the way the world worked. They trained everyone to think of themselves as the hero, who was just good beyond all reason and would get reward without any particular merit, just because they're the hero. My problem is not so much that they're an unrealistic presentation of the world as it is, but actually that they continually reinscribe the narrative shape of the world that we are living in, where there are winners and losers, there are, first person narrators, and then there's the rest of us. And those formulaic stories leave less room to do the work of creating something new, creating affordances that weren't previously part of the world. Right? And this has been something that's been discussed in, not just fantasy or SFF circles, but it's been also really thoroughly litigated in romance writing and fandom circles. Whether it is sufficient to simply tell the same story with different sorts of heroes, right? Is it enough? Does letting me read fiction with heroes who look like me or share some other significant characteristic that permits me to see myself in them, is that enough of an affordance to make it more possible for me to live in the world? And I'm not saying that doing that is worthless. I think it's important work. I am glad that a wider range of representation is being seen across otherwise very formulaic genre fiction, which I consume at a massive rate because it helps me wind my brain down at the end of the day. But I don't think that's enough, because, and this is me coming with my philosophy, theology, study of religion hat on, the problem is not who gets to be front and center in the world as it is. The problem is, the more general, wider narrative shape of the world that we have. The problem is that we have viewpoint characters and NPCs. We've got these kind of totalizing universalist ideas, someone's either going to be right or wrong. We don't have the narrative expectation of robust pluralism that we actually need to be able to live together as individuals among other individuals, richly and meaningfully.
We've got a question. We've got a question here, I think, it's picking up on that, apart from Alexandra, who asks, can fantasy literature be a form of protest from that part of the population who needs some magic / fantasy / imagination in their reality against the horrors of everyday life? My own experience is if you are full of fantasies and have a vivid imagination but already an adult, you're quite often considered a bit not normal, at least in my part of the world. My country, fantasy literature is still considered unworthy to be studied seriously by scholars.
Well, look, I am the very odd person who does engage with parts of philosophy and religious thought that are normally the province of very, very serious scholarship, in conversation with fantasy. So I'm responding more to the end of that question than the beginning. Absolutely doing that is, for me, an act of protest, right? Because you can't spend your entire life and the lives of everyone around you working on things like genocide and mass atrocities and accept a framing of the world in which those things happen that treats these as exceptions and treats them as horrible things to which the only possible response is deep, all-consuming, immobilizing sadness. That's, I learn a hell of a lot from reading the works, both fiction and nonfiction, of First Nation authors about this, because the turn in First Nations letters, especially in the last 10 years, has been a complete rejection of any of that all-consuming sadness narrative. It's, we will tell stories of living, and living fully and well, and being angry and being happy, and not performing the emotional response that our wider world narrative tells us is the only appropriate, normal response to the weight of history that we contend with. And so, yeah, that's a really long way of saying, yes, absolutely, fantasy literature is a form of protest on the part of people who need that bulwark against the horror of everyday life. But here's the other thing. We don't write or create anything else all by ourselves, all in our own heads. Literature or any other form of art making is about, it's not just altering our own individual narrative expectations. It's creating a collective imaginary. So while the single adult whose head is, a little bit full of fantasies and a little bit maybe not quite fully engaged in the world that surrounds them, they may be considered a little bit not normal. The adult who lives in a culture where these stories are told and retold and become part of the common currency is a person living in a society. And maybe the novels that we're talking about today are not those widely consumed, world-shaping sorts of shared experience. But we all know that our world is shaped by shared experience of fictional narratives. So it's not just, the act of putting stories into the world or reading stories is not just something that we do in our solitude that takes us away from the world that we are also living in, right?
Yeah. So good fantasy in some ways is someone putting forward a vision and saying, this should expand our sense of what the world can be. Normal is not enough. And then when people accept it, then that expands that notion, ideally. I do think that's, one of the ways to become a serious scholar is to define yourself quite tightly within an existing framework of some ways in which serious has already been determined. And one of the more interesting things to do is to think about whether the whole world's experiences can be considered within the framework of being serious in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, I recognize that as a good strategy for becoming a serious scholar. It is not the strategy that I have ever been able to embrace.
Yes, that's that. Yeah, I think people who are determined to be serious scholars are missing a trick. They're limiting their own horizons.
Yeah,
and that might be sort of institutionally canny in some respects, but it's not going to teach you as much as if you were prepared to occasionally think seriously about things that other people might consider unserious.
And I'm that's the crucial distinction that you've just made there, Matt. It's a habit of thought rather than a choice of topic, which I think characterizes actually serious scholarship. And we can exercise those habits of thought in relation to things that we find significant without needing our sense of significance to be everyone else's sense of significance. And that leads us nicely into the next question that I've just seen pop up.
It does, yeah. This is a tricky one. A. Gray asks, do you have any advice on how to read in a way to get more out of fiction, to open yourself to its affordances, to let it change your perspective?
Well, I'm following on from what we were just saying. Read what you love, right? And read obsessively, read weirdly, read deeply. Don't read unapologetically. Don't force. If you're struggling to find your way into a piece of fiction, to really engage in what you think it ought to be trying to tell you, to draw meaning from it, that's maybe not the piece of fiction that you need right at that moment. That's maybe not the thinking companion for whatever you're actually trying to puzzle your way through. And that's okay. We need to be okay and open about, and this goes back to, my real, banging of the drum for radical pluralism. We need to be okay about not everything needing to be significant to every person in the same way. It can't be. And I think we do, and as grateful as I am in many ways for my own education, which was, fairly great books focused, so that I finished secondary school, and I'd kind of done that stuff, and that's given me a good basis on which to then go off and do what I like otherwise. I also think we damage ourselves and perpetuate that damage on our students by trying to insist that the things that were most significant to our teachers are the things that we must learn the significance of ourselves and then pass on. I'm in the very awkward position right now for the first time in many years of being able to teach a class at university that involves a lot of fiction, because that's not something that normally happens in religious studies departments. And in the even odder position of having realized as I was planning that class that I couldn't set a reading list for it, because the reading list that I would set would be precisely what's significant to me, and probably precisely not what my students would actually get anything out of, other than the sense that they'd better pretend to like this book because Professor Vincent said it was her favorite, right? So instead, I have spent a lot of time talking with them about a lot of the stuff that we covered in this keynote about, how imagination intersects with the real world and what the ethical claims that of fiction may or may not be, and then sent them off to think about that in terms of whatever they would be working with anyways, because it's about habits of thought rather than the engagement with this or that piece of literature that has been culturally situated as canonically significant. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, I think
and well, I'm apologizing to the person who just typed in this question, and I might have answered a question that was, kind of 45 degrees off from the one they actually thought they were asking.
Yeah. I think you definitely addressed the question. Sort of one of the way to open philosophical affordances of fiction is to not assume that it's about you, but think about how it could be to some extent, but also not to force it. Sometimes you'll bounce off things, and that's fine. Don't assume it's bad, assume it's not for you, and go somewhere else. Does anyone else have other questions they would like to ask, as we'll have the organisers back on to close the conference in a moment? Oh, Sarah, So Sarah Nicholson says, thank you for a wonderful keynote. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the role of ancient apocalyptic literature as having a similar kind of social, political, or religious function, perhaps as a kind of fantasy that imagines new realities. She apologized for that being a bit off topic, but I think that is an apology that's not needed.
No, I don't think it's needed at all, Sarah. I would actually make a case for reading, for example, the Book of Revelations as fantasy, along precisely the lines that I've been arguing. If we are thinking about it as in functional terms, then yeah, it's really clear from everything we know historically about how these texts functioned that they were the fantasy literature of their time. Now, are we going to make the case for them as generative forms of fantasy literature still now? Are they still creating affordances in the world, or are they largely reinscribing the narrative shape of the world that has been formed largely by their communities of readers over several thousand years at this point? That's a harder one. That may really depend on specific readers rather than on the innate nature of the texts themselves.
That's a good answer. Does anyone else have a final question? Yes, you were reaching your last chances here. I have a sort of curious question about Iris Murdoch, that whether you think in her fiction she manages to practice what she preaches. I think I enjoy Iris Murdoch's fiction, but
well, that makes sense.
Oh, okay. So you would argue that she doesn't necessarily manage to imagine in the kind of expansive way she thinks in her sort of quite tight middle class milieus with her recurrent figures.
Let's go back to what we said about the difference between bad and not for me, and Iris Murdoch is definitely not for me. I think she has made, and she largely makes the mistake that a lot of realist writers make, thinking that a realistic depiction of the world as it is has to, it's very often, and maybe I've just been reading the wrong Murdoch novels, they tend to be fairly miserable, right? To me, her fiction is kind of the school of hard knocks. Life is kind of awful. You couldn't expect anything from it. You'll probably kill yourself, or someone else will. And this is realism, so just accustom yourself to it. Yeah, that.
I think I enjoy, but also could see fitting into that her characters who deliberately manipulate people into their worst states. She writes wonderful dogs, though, and very unrealistic dogs in some ways. They're incredibly benign and sort of rather wonderful in that sense. There's a couple more questions come in. So Androkura says, Le Guin talks about sci-fi and fantasy authors as authors of a larger reality, as those that can imagine freedom beyond our immediate political constraints. In those words, she sort of collapses the opposition between realism and fantasy, while also asserting the usefulness of fantasy as the genre that pushes the world to this larger reality. Does this relate to how you read affordances and value in certain works of fantasy?
Absolutely. And fair point, Andrew. I probably could have skipped this entire keynote and just sent you that essay of Le Guin. Sorry.
I don't think that needs to be apologised at all. I mean, Le Guin says things in her Le Guinish way, but there are other ways of saying those things, and Le Guin would be keen that they're said in different ways by different people. That's kind of the shaking. A final one from Meg, and I think we'll be appearing in a moment with the other organisers to wrap up this conference. "'Tis the season for me and many others to take forward the great Hogfather rereading. Your keynote resonated with the part of imagined futures that changed the world in belief. No, you need to believe in things that aren't true." I'm afraid I cannot do a very good Terry Pratchett death voice. You'll have to imagine this is a Terry Pratchett Wentworth. "No, you cannot believe in things that aren't true. How else can they? You need to believe in things that aren't true, rather. How else can they become? Do we need fantasy not only to give us the tools to make new worlds, but also to believe they will survive and thrive and that they are wanted?"
Yeah. Not just that the new worlds we make will survive and thrive and are wanted, Meg. We need fantasy to believe that we will survive and thrive and are wanted. We need to start by believing the little lies. It's practice for believing the big ones.
Excellent. That's wonderful speech. That sort of Susan death exchange. I don't think we could ask for a better note to end on, really. So I will just thank Alana for their wonderful contribution to conclude this conference. I will cede my role of Master of Ceremonies, if I've ever been mastering the ceremonies, precisely to the organisers of the conference. I think, Taylor, you will reappear at this point, summoned back into being, and you will bring in the other organisers. And I will thank Alana again, and I will mute and step off the stage so that you can wrap up this wonderful event.
Okay, I'm just promoting the rest of the committee here to panelists so they can all join us here.